Today, I'm going to be talking about the different measurements. Stay tuned and I'll show you what they do. Hi everyone, this is Kevin with Inventimore, and today I'm going to talk about measurements. That's the dimensions here. There's three different measurements that Blender has. There's the basic Blender units, that's what the default is, that's what it's in right now. And then there's metric, that's basically the metric system, the millimeters, centimeters, meters, all that. And then there's Imperial, like inches and feet and things like that. And to change those, you go to the scene button here. It's the third one in. You have the Blender units, which is none. Metric changes it to meters, and Imperial changes it to feet. And typically, I use Blender units for pretty much everything. The only time I use metric is for, like, if I'm working with a gaming system. Or for specifically 3D printing, I just leave it as Blender units because you don't have to adjust anything because these stay as millimeters no matter what you do. I have examples of each of these in the three different programs. I have Repetier-Host, in which I exported all three different types with a 20 millimeter cube, and they all ended up pretty much as their default size in real world. But that's not with the metric and Imperial, because they're, for some reason, I don't know why, they're not scaled properly. It's they're really, really small. You have to increase the size by 1,000. No, not that one. Go to the metric one and increase it by 1,000, then it'll show up and it appears. Same with the Imperial one. If you scale it up by 1,000, it appears, and then it's actually 20 millimeters. I just converted it to millimeters. It's actually 787 thousandths or something like that. I don't really use the Imperial at all, even though I am in the US. I don't really find a need for it. But that was just an example of that. To change the scaling on it, there's a couple things you can do. If you're insisting on using metric, you can change it by changing the scale here, because right now it's saying that this cube that was 20 Blender units is now 20 meters, which actually correlates exactly across for gaming, because 20 meters is 20 meters. In the game engines, most of the time the scale actually represents the exact size, and it actually works for all of them. Blender units, the one Blender unit is 1 meter, so metric and Blender units pretty much go hand in hand, except for the 3D printing, which is the Blender units are millimeters basically. So with this, I can change this to 20 millimeters, and you just have to type mm after you type it, and it changes it to centimeters. But it's another reason why I don't really use the metric, because you have to type in whatever unit you want after it. You have to type mm for millimeter, or cm for centimeters, or m for meter. You have to change it all the time if you're typing it in. That's why I like Blender units. You don't have to put anything in after it. Same with Imperial. You have to put feet or inches or whatever. And here it has it in thousandths, but that's what 20 centimeters or 20 millimeters is in Imperial. It's 787.402 thousandths, which to me, I don't know why we still use the Imperial measurements here in the US. There's some things I still use it for, but not very much. I've pretty much switched to metric by using everything. But in order to get it to scale properly in things like Repetier and the game engines and everything, or actually Repetier mainly for the 3D printing, you have to scale it by 1,000. So that makes this 65 feet to get it to show the right size. And that's not really realistic working with it in exporting it or anything like that. With the Another thing you can do is when you actually do export it by itself, you can keep using it as the regular size there. You can go to File, Export. FBX is for Unreal Engine 4, and STL is for Repetier. But if you go to the Imperial measurements here, there's a scale down here. You really want to make sure you select only, but you can export it as a scale. I'll just name this number 2. And so it changes it, and then you can import it again. And this one. And so it added in there, so you can scale it that way, or you can scale it here, or you can scale it at where you start. But that's the difference between that and like Unity. Another thing that they have, like when you look at the different things, I already imported them all, but the Blender units one is actually a 20 meter cube, and these ones are actually 20 millimeters is the size of them. And they just pretty much translate to actual size. Blender units just go to meters instead of millimeters in the gaming engine. Same thing with Unreal Engine. It's the huge giant Blender unit cube, and then the small Imperial and metric. They're basically the same size. And that all goes back to the scaling difference. That's why I use just Blender units for 3D printing. It's just so much easier to work with. And another thing that you need to remember when you're working with scaling objects is the scale always changes here. And to get that set to the scale of 1, you always want to get it back to the scale of 1. You press Control A, and it goes back to scale. And it changes it back to the same right scale. And so that's scaled as 1. Even if you change this here now, it changes it back to a really huge size. So rather than doing that, I just keep it on the Blender units for everything. See, now this is really tiny. That's what size it is. It's basically 0.02 millimeters when it's exported. So if we want to change that to 20 millimeters, see, now the scale is huge like that. You can set the scale, but this will export into 3D printing just as that size that it is. It won't. You don't have to worry about the metrics or anything like that. Just remember this is millimeters. And another reason why I don't like the using the metric is because if you have something that's, say, less than a meter, it converts to centimeters, and you got all the different lengths because it rounds them to the nearest length. Like if it's centimeters, if it's less than a meter, and it's millimeters if it's less than a centimeter, and it's always changing that. With the Blender units, it stays all as millimeters straight across because you can just like 900 millimeters. It's like almost 3 feet, or a yard, or a meter. But it just stays in that unit, so it's just one standard thing. It works as millimeters. That's why I like it that way. But that's pretty much all I had to really talk about today. Just remember when you change an object in the object mode, it does change the scale. And if you go into edit mode, actually let's change the scale back to 1. So Control A and scale changes it back to 1. If you go into edit mode, you can change the scale all sorts of different ways, and then it stays at 1. But if you change the size outside of edit mode, it'll actually change the scale too. So whenever you scale the object to what you want it to be, if you are trying to export it, it really doesn't matter for 3D printing at all, the scaling options, but for gaming and stuff like that, it really does matter because the scale has to be 1:1. And that's the difference between that. For 3D printing, it's not really that important. For game engines, you have to make sure you keep 1:1 scale. And then there's the skeletons trying to export animation models and things like that, that's a whole different complicated issue. That's for like advanced type stuff. I might get into that eventually, but for right now, it's really just always try to remember to scale the object to 1:1. But that's pretty much it for today, and I'll have another video on Friday since this one's so short, and I'll talk about the background image and how you can model stuff by loading an image and sizing it to get an accurate model size, and have the picture there for reference just to help you model it. Anyway, I'll probably upload that this weekend, and that's it for now. Have a good day.